Hi everyone, my name is Saoirse Cummins and I'm a technologist at Teagasc, Johnstown Castle, County Wexford in Ireland. And today I'm going to talk about one of my PhD experiments, which was an annual assessment of N2O, or nitrous oxide, emissions from multi-species grasslands. And just to add that this project was a collaboration between Teagasc and Rothamsted Research and the University of Reading in the UK. And I'd also like to thank the BGS for the opportunity to present my work today. So just to give some background information, so following the IPCC's fifth assessment report, the Paris Agreement was put in place in 2015, and this gave countries targets to meet. And these, while I suppose some countries have individual targets, but overall they are to meet a 30% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and to maintain this downward trajectory to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. So then of the greenhouse gases, nitrous oxide is particularly potent as it has a global warming potential around 260 times that of CO2. And it can also persist in the atmosphere for more than 100 years. So it's a relatively long-lived greenhouse gas. So nitrous oxide is a major source of N2O, particularly from application to land. So I suppose we're all familiar with the picture on the right of an intensive livestock system, which more often than not consists of a perennial ryegrass monoculture that receives high nitrogen application. But going forward, to meet our greenhouse gas targets, agriculture is going to have to expand sustainably, so produce more food with less emissions. So why multi-species swords and how might they influence nitrous oxide emissions? So legumes, as we all know, legumes promote nitrogen fixation into the soil, and they also add nitrogen into the soil system through the root decomposition and residues. So this is going to reduce your overall N requirements, and it'll also alter the way soil cycles carbon and nitrogen. And so transgressive over-yielding, this is a common phenomenon that happens in multi-species swords. So it's where a diverse mixture will outperform the highest performing monoculture, and it's often denoted to niche complementarity between species and increase nitrogen use efficiency. So this is going to decrease the amount of nitrogen available in the soil. Also, different species will have different root structures, especially chicory, so the blue flower there in the picture. So this has a deep tap root, and this is going to affect soil gas diffusivity. There's also compounds in plantain or plantago called biological nitrification inhibition compounds, BNI compounds, and what these do is they stabilize nitrogen in its ammonia form, and this is going to prevent nitrification, which is the pathway between ammonia and nitrate. And this process is where a lot of nitrous oxide is lost into the atmosphere. So the aims of this experiment were to investigate the effect of plant diversity on annual N2O emissions and N2O emissions intensity. I'll talk a bit more about that later, but it includes nitrogen yield scaled and dry matter yield scaled N2O emissions, and to compare N2O emissions and emissions intensity between the 150 N communities with the 300 N Lowland perennial community. So just to talk a bit about the experimental design. So this experiment followed a simplex experimental design with 20 communities which included between 1 and 6 species and was replicated between 1 and 4 times. So this design, it allowed us to predict the N2O emissions according to the proportion of each species and functional group within a mixture. So we looked at the grass functional group, perennial ryegrass and timothy, the legume functional group, which included red and white clover, and the herb functional group, so chicory and plantain. And so different apexes of the triangle represent monocultures of the functional groups, and the 6 species mixture there is represented in the middle. So this experiment, it ran between March 2018 and March 2019, and it included a full agronomic season, so 5 cuts and 5 nitrogen applications. So 150 kgs of N per hectare for all communities bar the lowly and perennial community, which had a 300 N comparison. And nitrous oxide was sampled post-fertilizer application using the static gas chambers, as you can see in the picture there. And nitrous oxide was sampled intensively after application and less so, especially in the winter months. Sorry. So just here, this is an aerial photograph of the experimental site. So you can see the gas chambers there in the corner and the drought shelters, which were used in a separate experiment. And you can see that this was taken during summer of 2018, where there was a drought, so the grass is quite dry outside. So here's a temporal trace of the nitrous oxide emissions for each species and the 6 species mixture throughout the year. And the blue dotted line, this represents water-filled pore space. This is one of the key drivers of N2O emissions. So you can see it's quite higher in the spring months when the water-filled pore space was high, and it drops then in the summer. And the black arrows there, they represent the fertilizer application events. So this graph shows the annual cumulative nitrous oxide emissions for each species and the 6 species mixture. So I think what's interesting is that we can see here that by doubling fertilizer application, you're also going to double your N2O emissions. And while there is no decrease in N2O emissions from the 6 species mixture, there's no increase, and I suppose it's noteworthy it's worthwhile to say that this despite a relatively high legume proportion of 1/3. So here we have a ternary diagram of the N2O emissions. So each corner of the triangle represents a different functional group. So we have our grass represented up at the top, legume and herb. So we can see here that there's high N2O emissions associated with the legume monoculture, and less so with herb species. So here we have yield scaled N2O emissions or emissions intensity analysis. So some people might be more familiar with this as regards methane. So this would be a common way of presenting methane emissions, kind of emissions per unit output, but it's less commonly used for N2O. And in this case, it describes the cost of N2O per unit yield produced. So we can see here that the 6 species mixture here is significantly lower than lowly and perennial at both 150 kgs of N per hectare per year and 300 kgs of N per hectare per year. And then just to show the ternary diagrams for the emissions intensity analysis. What's particularly useful about these graphs is that they show the emissions associated with functional group or species proportion. So it's clear here that you can diverge away from kind of an equal proportion 6 species mixture while still maintaining your benefits. So here we have on the left N2O per kg per ton dry matter yield, and on the right there and the N2O emissions per kg nitrogen biomass yield produced. So then, just to conclude, there were strong plant identity effects and diversity effects on N2O emissions from intensively managed grassland swards. We saw the strong fertilizer effect on N2O emissions and the low cost of N2O and high yield associated with a 6 species mixture, especially looking at biomass N. And then from the ternary diagrams, we saw the ability to diverge away from the equal proportion 6 species mixture while still maintaining benefits.